I'm a painter. I live and work in London, and about 8 years ago, I wrote some short essays on painting. I did it not because I think I'm a writer, but because there were issues that weren't being discussed or written about by critics or historians or anyone else. And so I felt I should try and say something. I did, in the end, I think I did 5 short essays on different aspects of painting. And each essay has a different title. And after they were written, they were put up on WordPress, and I sent out a link to a few friends, but it hasn't been advertised. And the other thing that I thought was that although I wanted to make my point and make it concisely and briefly, I think I need to say a little more in order for things to be understood better. And so what I'm going to do is to talk a little about the first essay, which is titled Manet's Legacy, and to try and explain why I think it's important and why, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about isn't known by most people, not known by most artists, and not known by museum directors or curators or critics. But at the same time, it might jog someone's memory. And if it does, I hope they'll think about it, think about what I'm saying, and maybe something will happen. People will discuss it among themselves, assuming this is ever heard. So, what I wrote on my piece, originally my WordPress piece, was that Manet is an artist who changed the course of painting. His influence has been enormous. However, there's a question to be asked. Why is he considered a revolutionary when his paint language so closely resembles earlier artists like Goya and Velázquez? Is it to do with his subject matter? In paintings like Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Olympia, he exposed contemporary sexual hypocrisy and scandalized the bourgeoisie in Paris. But if this is the reason for his enduring fame, he would be a kind of political art propagandist or a painter like Constantin Guise, a man of his time, not necessarily a great painter whose paintings transcend their time. I believe it is precisely through his paint language that he made his most important contribution to painting. He sensed the mainstream of painting had been corrupted by pseudo-classicism. Painters like Delaroche and Bouguereau, they didn't want to transform the world. They wanted to make paintings which would be acceptable to the public. And they are precursors of modern advertising, where things are made to appear nicer than they are. Also, I think that there was an element in Bouguereau's work and also in Delaroche of early photography, because artists started using photography before the middle of the 19th century, and they used it to make their work more subtle, but also to make it appear realistic, to appear like a sort of realism that everyone can see and everyone can understand. In a sense, the photograph is a democratic image. You don't need to know about art to understand a photograph or to read a photograph. Everyone can do it. And this is what the mid-19th century academic artists like Bouguereau and Delaroche were using, because they knew they didn't want to alienate the public, they wanted to please the public, and also their images were made to appear sweet and sugary and appealing, the very opposite of what might have been going on in Paris at that time. And Manet's painting, when he first exhibited the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which I think was in 1863, it was rejected by the Salon, and then it was shown later at the Salon des Refusés. And one of the things that shocked people at the time, of course, was the fact that there was a naked woman posing outside on the grass with 2 clothed men. And this obviously made it clear that this woman may have been a prostitute who was being employed by these two young men to have fun and enjoyment at the weekend, sexual enjoyment with the men at the weekend. And although this was actually happening in Paris and elsewhere, probably in France, and the bourgeoisie knew it was happening, nevertheless they didn't want it to be seen. And the way Manet presented it was so abrupt and blunt that it really did upset and offend many people. But the thing that hasn't been talked about, this has been written about by historians, Manet's ability to shock and upset the bourgeoisie. What hasn't been written about is why his paint language was shocking. Until Manet, no artist painted with a full chromatic range. Manet is the first. So what he did, unlike Velázquez and Goya, who were artists he admired and was influenced by, he included black and white in his chromatic spectrum, and he painted black and white as not as tones, but as color, part of a chromatic structure. Now, until that happened, all artists were using if they were using paint, they were using a semi-color, semi-tonal language. In the Renaissance, it was the first time when painting became fully three-dimensional, and then shortly after the linear discovery of perspective came aerial perspective discovery by Leonardo. Leonardo made experiments and included atmospheric perspective into his painting. So in a sense, already by doing that, there was a considerable amount of information to make an equivalent of the way things appear. And the thing is, the problem with this is that the color in painting was always, to some extent, subordinate to the drawing. So by drawing in a monochrome way, an artist would work out the space, the extent of the forms that he wanted, the recession, etc., all kinds of subtle things that might have been required. And then color would be added. And the color, the reason for drawing and understanding the space through drawing is that color, when it's put down, even if you put the right color equivalent for the things you're looking at, the color doesn't behave in the way you think it's going to. In other words, you might paint a still life with all the right colors, but you'll find that the colors won't stay in their place. So it's the drawing that will help the colors to stay in their place, and the drawing can also help you to move things around, bring things forward and backward and so on. It all depends. So Manet was the first to dispense with this idea of drawing, controlling the color. He used color he made color contrast to make space. Now, this sounds odd, but the truth is that what happens is that the space that Manet produced in painting like Déjeuner sur l'herbe is very disjunctive. You paint a color for the woman's flesh, and then right next to it is a man's trouser and maybe his jacket, and there doesn't seem to be any recessional give in the way from one color to another. Each color is kind of forcing itself up to the surface, vying for your attention. And in a way, I think this is what Manet was looking for. He was looking for colors that would be sort of perpendicular to the picture plane, and then when you saw these colors, each color would have its role in the painting, but they would be playing against each other. They wouldn't be fitting into an allotted space. The space that would be made would be created by the color contrast. And this was such a shocking thing to do. At the time, many artists disliked his paintings, and some of the older artists and the more successful artists said all he's done is dispense with the middle tone. This piece of information was repeated and has been repeated, for many, many years, right into the 20th century. It's completely wrong, because Manet was the first artist not to paint with tones. He painted chromatically. He was also the first artist not to use glazes. So Manet in order to paint something translucent like someone's hair, it was done completely by color contrast, color references that to each other that would produce translucency in one part and opacity in another part. So again, this was shockingly new, and a few younger artists realized there was something unusual, special going on. And of course, Manet influenced Monet, and from Monet certainly understood something about Manet's discoveries, but Monet went in a different direction. He used the chromatic structure that Manet invented, but he used it in a way that would become even more atmospheric than Manet's paintings, as Manet's paintings are not particularly atmospheric, and Monet didn't use black. He substituted blue for black, and white was used, but not pure white. So in a sense, his color range is slightly smaller. The other artist, of course, who was very influenced was Cézanne, and Cézanne also used a smaller range, but Cézanne used color contrast to produce the form in a very extreme way. And when you look at paintings by Cézanne, you can see how forms that are supposed to be in the background obtrude their place, and sometimes forms that are in the foreground seem to sink back. And there is a kind of dynamic play of color in the paintings by Cézanne. What I want to say is that although this is true, what I'm saying, the reason why I'm bringing it up is that from Manet, you go to Impressionism and Cézanne, but also you come into the 20th century with Matisse and Picasso, and Matisse is probably the artist who was who used Manet's discoveries most comprehensively, because Matisse also made paintings out of color contrast. And when Matisse's paintings were first seen, they were shocking people. So the idea that a painting can be made through color contrast alone is still not something that everyone understands or can accept. And because nowadays photography has become so prevalent, in a sense, it's not unlike the period that was happening around Manet, except of course the photography is much more sophisticated now. But so in a sense, the European tradition, which Manet reinvigorated in the middle of the 19th century, we could say that it ended sometime in the late 40s or the 50s of the last century, the 20th century, and the American tradition took over. And to some extent, I believe that's true. But I think there are remnants of the European tradition, and I think that artists and maybe museum directors and whoever may see this little video, they should think about this and just ask themselves, has the European tradition really come to an end? I don't think it has, and I hope if anyone sees this, they'll think about this.